CEC 6x16 Screen It Setup and Maintenance Training Video. Welcome to Construction Equipment Company and the setup and process video of your CEC 6x16 Screen It plant. We'll be going through all of the setup and troubleshooting of your CEC Screen It. So let's get started. Startup. When your plant arrives, it's critical to block the plant as level and steady as possible. So make sure you have a nice long level with you. All setup of your plant is done at idle with the Deutz diesel engine. The Deutz engine is a 98 horsepower turbocharged air-cooled diesel engine and is mounted underneath your plant with a built-in roof to protect the engine, hydraulic valves, fuel, and hydraulic oil tank. Please refer to your owner's manuals for all the maintenance schedules. Before you start the engine, make sure all controls are in the neutral position and that the throttle is nearly turned all the way down before you start the engine. To start the engine, simply push in the Murphy switch and hold it in. Then turn the key. Hold in the Murphy switch until the oil pressure has come up to 60 psi on the oil pressure gauge, then release. This may take all of 2 seconds. Let the engine warm up for a few minutes before you start the setup. Go up the ladder and check in the hopper to make sure that it's clear. There may be blocking or screen cloth that was shipped with the plant, and all of this must be taken out prior to setting up the plant to avoid any damage. Toolbox. Included with the CEC Screen It is a toolbox. Included in the toolbox are some extra hydraulic fittings, 4 bolts and nuts that will be needed to tie down the feed conveyor system, a couple of extra screening bolts, some grease fittings for your grease gun for those hard-to-get-to areas, a fuel gauge, and a good place to store the tie-down straps that will be on all the conveyors. The fuel tank on the 6x16 Screen It holds 65 gallons of diesel fuel, which will give you approximately 18 hours of running. The fuel gauge that has been provided in the toolbox is a float system. Take the cap nut on the fuel tank off the outlet and install the fuel gauge per the instructions in the box. The hydraulic oil tank, which is mounted next to the fuel tank, holds 110 gallons of hydraulic oil. There is an auxiliary outlet if you need to run off-board conveyors, stackers, or a shredder. Hydraulic jacking legs. There will be a red pin in each of the hydraulic jacking legs for shipping. Remove the cotter pin and the red pin from each leg and store in the bottom of the control panel or in the toolbox for future use. To start working the hydraulic jacking legs, go to the controls and push in the hydraulic leg valve handle. This will open the valve so the 2 control handles positioned above can run the hydraulic jacking legs up and down. Each leg is run independently from the other, which will make it easier for setup, especially on uneven ground. Under the hydraulic jacking legs, please put a block under each leg. If the ground is soft, make sure that these blocks are big enough to lessen the chance of the legs sinking into the ground. The bigger the block, the less the chance. Lower the jacking legs to lift the plant high enough to get rid of the tractor. Once the tractor is gone, then you can start blocking up the plant. It's critical to block the plant level side to side and end to end. Also, leveling high enough to get the rear tires off the ground. Under no circumstances should you operate the plant without proper blocking procedures. There's too much action in the screen that would send vibration to the frame, wheels, and bearings. This vibration would cause excessive damage to your plant. Blocking. There are 5 different blocking points, A, B, C, D, and E, with an adjacent blocking point on the opposite side of the plant. To start blocking, lower the hydraulic jacking legs so the plant is high enough to get blocks under point A. Raise the hydraulic legs, which will lower the plant onto point A, and keep raising the hydraulic legs so the plant is low enough to bring the wheels and tires off the ground. Then block under points B and C. Then lower the legs to raise the plant onto the blocks A and B, and then level points A and B. Use a 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch shims as needed. It is critical to get the plant level from points A to B and level side to side from both points A and B. Once this is done, level points B to C, end to end, and side to side. Now that this is all level, go to point E and remove the cotter pin and washer from the painted red pin. Remove the pin and lower the telescopic leg down from the main frame. There are 3 holes in this drop-down leg, and you may have to use one of the first 2 holes depending on your conditions. Most of the time, you'll drop the leg down, put the pin back into the top hole, and replace the washer and the cotter pin. Now do the same to the other side at point E. Then raise the plant and put your blocking underneath both points E. Shim to make level from A to E and level side to side at point E. Once this is done, then go back to point D. Raise the plant and get your blocking to the approximate height needed. Then bring the plant back down onto point D. Check level and shim accordingly. Now you can go back and check the levelness of all points. If level, go around to all the blocking points and kick all the blocks, making sure they're all secure. If not, go back and add or delete shims accordingly to make the plant level end to end and side to side. This makes a good and solid base for operation. The hydraulic jacking legs should now be off the ground and remain off the ground, as they are never used as a blocking point. Conveyors. When the plant comes standard from CEC, we add tie-down straps to keep the conveyor belting from flapping in the wind as the unit is traveling down the road. We put one at the lower end and one at the higher end. We also put in 2 2x4s to take up any excess slack that the tie-downs didn't take care of. Remove these and put them into a safe place, as you may need them again when you decide to move the plant. The side folding conveyors have 2 brackets on each that need to come off prior to folding out. Both brackets are painted red. The long bracket needs to be loosened on the conveyor, and the other end needs to have the bolt and nut taken off. Then slide the bracket down to the pre-drilled hole on the frame of the conveyor and reattach. This is a safe place to store the bracket for future use. The CEC 6x16 2-deck screenet comes standard with 2 side discharge conveyors, unless you have a 6x16 3-deck screenet, and then you will have 3 discharge conveyors. These conveyors need to be set up and broken down with the engine at idle. This is very important, as severe damage could occur if the conveyors are not folded out or in with the engine at idle. They each have their own control valves to move them into the operating position. The conveyor needs to come out slow and smooth when going into the operating position, as well as when you're folding the conveyors back up. Just barely feather the handle in and out to accomplish this. Make sure that you've removed all the bracing and brackets, as well as the 2x4s, before you do this. Feeder. Now that you've unfolded all the side discharge conveyors, it's time to move the hydraulic feeder into the working position. The CEC Screenit comes standard with a hydraulic feeder that must be moved up into the operating position, as well as down into the transport position. This achieves the height of 13 feet 6 inches, which is the standard for most departments of transportation. The feeder hydraulic valve actuates the cylinders, which moves the feeder into the operating position as well as into the transport position. There are 4 bolts, which must be placed into the main frame to keep the conveyor in the operating position. The underscreen side discharge conveyor must be down in the operating position when running the feed conveyor up or down. The feeder is liable to catch the conveyor and damage it. Startup of plant. Now that you've accomplished the setup with the engine at idle, go back to the control panel and counterclockwise turn the throttle cable to full throttle. This will be at 2500 RPM as shown on the tachometer meter. Do not push the throttle button in and pull. Turn the throttle cable counterclockwise. There is also a temp gauge, a voltmeter, an oil pressure gauge, and an hour meter. Now that the engine and the hydraulics are warmed up, engage the screen. To engage, make sure that you push the handle of the valve in towards the plant and not out. Let the screen get into full rotation, which is at 880 RPMs. Once this is accomplished, engage the rear discharge conveyor, and then go ahead and engage the underscreen and the front side discharge conveyor, which runs in a series. Now you can engage the feed conveyor. This is done by a toggle switch located next to the ignition switch. There is a toggle switch on the control panel as well as on the handrail of the catwalk. If both switches are being pushed at the same time, you will blow a fuse. If at any time you blow the fuse and you don't have a spare fuse, there is a manual override on the feeder. Simply undo this bolt, take the nut and bolt out, and manually control the feed speed by the red PTO control knob. Shutdown. The shutdown of the CEC Screenit is as follows. Simply stop the feeder belt so material isn't still spilling onto the screen. Shut down the screen by pulling the valve handle out to the neutral position. Always start and stop the screen at full RPM. Let the screen get out of full rotation before you disengage the other hydraulic components. Then stop the rear conveyor and the underscreen and front conveyor. Let the engine slow down and then twist the throttle cable clockwise. Let the engine idle all the way down. Wait a few minutes to cool down. Then turn off the ignition. Emergency shutdown. Up on the handrail of the catwalk, just below the speed switch for the feeder, is an emergency shutdown push-button switch. What this does, if there's trouble on the Screenit and you're up there working, it allows you to shut down the entire plant. If you are down on the ground, simply turn the key off. Then you need to run the feed conveyor to a stop, move the throttle control back down to idle, put all the controls for the conveyors back into neutral position, and restart the plant as discussed earlier. Tracking and tension of belts. Now that you know how to start up and shut down the CEC Screen-It, you need to track and tension the conveyor belts. When tensioning the feed conveyor belt, you will be using the slack adjusters or take-ups. You want to make sure that the pillow block bearings are an equal distance from the opening of the take-up. Here at 4.5 inches, we want to make sure that the other side is 4.5 inches as well. This way, we know that the shaft is an equal distance from the head pulley on both sides. Most of the time, you can track the feeder belt to the middle of the head pulley by the slack adjusters, but you have to readjust when the feed belt is loaded, as it will track differently. Also, you still want to have the tail pulley square with the head pulley, keeping those distances the same. Make sure the belt doesn't track too far to the right or too far to the left. Make sure you track this so it's equally spaced in the middle of the head pulley so that no belt damage can occur and your operation can be consistent. When tracking the belts, one of the things that can make a difference is how you're loading the material onto the belt, or how the skirt board rubber may be attached to the belt. You want to make sure there is a 1/16 inch gap between the skirt board rubber and belt, but not touching. That way, the material will not be able to spill underneath and will not touch or track the belt. The skirt board rubber needs to be replaced when worn or when it gets out of adjustment. There are also better ways of tracking the belt rather than just using the take-ups. The take-ups are mostly used for tensioning the belt. Please look in the manual or view the belt tracking and adjustment service video later on in this video to learn how the return rolls and the troughing idlers can adjust the belt in a better fashion without over-tensioning the belt. Over-tensioning the belt can damage the shaft, damage the head pulley, damage the tail pulley, and all the bearings involved. There's also a good section on belt tracking later in this video. Now that the feed conveyor is tensioned and tracked properly, do the same for each side of the discharge conveyors and the underscreen conveyor. On all the discharge conveyors and underscreen conveyor, there is a belt wiper tensioned by 2 leaf steel springs. A bolt runs through a bracket, tensioning these to run the wiper up against the belt for good cleaning. It is possible to get a belt wiper too tight. If this happens, a belt may stall or track left or right. If you start having tracking problems or stalling problems, check to make sure that the belt wipers are not too tight. Ramp. Now that the plant is set up, it's often necessary to build a ramp for a loader to dump material into the hopper. By placing a piece of plywood or some concrete blocks here, you'll be preventing the ramp material from building up underneath the plant. You may have to put this on the side if you're planning to side load. When debris builds up underneath the plant, a lot of things can happen. You won't know if the plant is still blocked properly at these points and will make it difficult to level. It is critical to have the plant blocked and steady on all blocking points. Debris building up underneath the plant does not allow air circulation and can overheat the Deutz diesel engine. So it's very important to have some kind of barrier on the back or on the side so material doesn't build up underneath the plant. You also may want to put a barrier underneath the front end of the plant where material dumps off the top deck and down the top deck overshoot. This prevents material from damaging the rear tail lights, brakes, hubs, and bearings. It will also make it a lot easier for the loader to load and clean up the oversized material. A CEC Screen-It comes from the factory after going through a thorough pre-shipping schedule. After your machine has been in the field for some time, Nuts, bolts, brackets, hydraulic fittings, couplers, and bushings can and do come loose. Part of your maintenance schedule requires you to go back and retighten those loose brackets, nuts, and bolts. Greasing schedule. Along with your daily maintenance, a greasing schedule must also be maintained. All pillow blocks on head and tail pulleys of all conveyors need to be greased with 1 to 2 pumps of grease every other day when operating. The troughing rollers have a Zerk fitting on the outside. They have a sealed, greasable bearing on the inner side. All conveyor rolls and return rolls need to be greased with several pumps of grease every 2 to 3 months, and depending on conditions, you may have to alter the schedule. Do not over-grease these, as you may blow out seals. The CEC 6x16 Screenit has 140 mm bearings running in oil. These bearings will have a sight glass mounted on the side of the screen next to the bearing housing. The oil level will vary slightly depending on the temperature of the oil. If the oil is hot, it will expand and show a little higher level than if cold. When checking the oil, make sure the oil is visible in the sight glass, normally in the middle. If the oil is not visible, then add oil until it's halfway up the sight glass. Normally, you may not need to add any oil between oil changes. If you are adding oil often, there may be an oil leak. The oil in these running in oil bearings should have the oil changed every 3 months or 500 hours of running time. It will be easier to change and drain the oil when it is warm or hot. Again, depending on conditions, this schedule may have to change. Feed hopper. In the feed hopper of your CEC Screenit, the pieces move together in what we call a wedge. After using the machine and putting a lot of material through it, these will build up with material on the hinge and back along the wedge. It's very important to get this material away from these so they can move freely when moving the feeder back down for transport or for when you're changing the bottom deck screen cloth. This will keep from damaging the outside torque arm and make sure buildup and potential bridging does not occur. In the hopper there is a crossmember or strike-off bar with rubber sheeting and a bar hanging from it. This is used to knock down material to prevent surges onto the screen. It helps keep an even flow of material onto the screen for optimum screening. It's designed for materials such as sand and gravel, dirt, topsoil, compost, and many others. In some materials, such as oversized dig materials, big rocks, concrete with rebar, asphalt, or anything that could be hung up and damage or rip the belt, you need to take the strike-off bar out. This is not a support for the hopper, so removing it is safe. It's very important to look at your material before screening. If the material looks like it will not pass under, become a bridging problem, or cause damage to the belt, then take it out. Loading. When dumping materials such as sand and gravel, topsoil, heavy materials, and hard-to-screen materials, start by feathering in the material. Then dump material on top of material. Try to dump material in the middle of the feeder belt and hopper. Keep your feed speed on the feeder in a position so you don't run out of material as the work progresses. With easy-to-bridge type materials such as compost, you may want to load from the side and dump your material in the middle of the feeder and hopper. This will help lessen the chances of bridging. Screen cloth. Normally, your CEC Screenit will come with your requested sizes of screen cloth already installed in the screen. However, screen cloth does wear out, or you may want to make a different sized product. Then you'll have to change the screen cloth. If you have to change both decks, start by removing the top deck ,1st. Then take the bottom deck out. If you just need to change out the bottom deck, it's not necessary to take out the top deck. Make sure you have folded out the underscreen side discharge conveyor, then lower the feed hopper back down into the travel position. Now you can slide out the bottom deck screen cloth either through the top or slide it out the back. To remove the top deck screen, simply remove these 3 bolts. The feed plate that runs across the top keeps the top piece of the screen centered. These 3 bolts need to come out. Remove the feed plate and set it on the feeder belt. The feed plate rubber is critical to marry the feeder and the screen, which stops spillage in between the top deck and the bottom deck. Make sure you keep this piece in place after screen installation. It's very important. The top deck has 3 sections of screen cloth, all the same size, with dimensions of 70.5 inches outside hook by 64 inches long. After the first 2 sections, there is a 4-inch drop onto the 3rd section. Now you must remove all the clamp rails. Remove all the nuts on the carriage bolts. Remove all the clamp rails. If possible, try to keep the carriage bolts in the clamp rails, as it will make it easier to put the clamp rails back when putting the screen cloth back on. Now the top deck is ready to take off. The crown bar rubber that the screen cloth rests on protects the underscreen rails and is critical for screen cloth wear. It needs to be in excellent working condition on all the seams and on all decks of the screen. This piece of crown bar rubber is in good working condition. If it's beaten up, cut, or chattered, the screen won't work properly and premature screen wear can occur, thereby increasing costs. To change the bottom deck, remove all nuts on the carriage bolts from the outside of the screen. Some of the nuts will not be accessible with an impact wrench, so you'll have to use a hand wrench or ratchet. Again, it's much easier to put the clamp rails back on if you leave the carriage bolts on the clamp rails. Remove all the clamp rails. You may have to use a pry bar to release some of the clamp rails. Make sure that the clamp rails are up and out of the way. Now you can remove the bottom deck screen cloth. You can remove it through the opening between the feeder, which is in the down position, and the screen, or take them out through the bottom of the screen, or both. Normally, it's easier to take all the lower deck screen cloth out through the top. However, especially with heavier screen cloth and screens that are not very flexible to take out the top, you may have to take these out the back of the screen. To do this, you need to take these 2 bolts out and then swing the top deck overshoot up and over. The chute will pivot here, then all the way over. You will have to work the screen cloth a little to get it past the screen's discharge lips. Once all the screens are out, you need to go back to all the clamp rails and make sure all the dirt and debris is cleaned off on the underside of the clamp rails and all the bolts are clean. Then you need to make sure that all screen rails are cleaned off, a crowbar works fine, to ensure a clean, tight fit when reinstalling your screens. New screen cloth. When replacing your screen cloth, always put the bottom or lower decks in before you install the top deck. It will make the installation much easier. Slide all your bottom deck screens in and make sure they're centered properly and that the topmost screen is resting on the top of this screen bar. This will ensure that this deck's overs do not contaminate the fines. Now that they're placed, bring in the clamp rails. You will have one rail section with 6 bolts and 2 rail sections with 5 bolts for each side of the screen. Always start at the top with the longer 6-bolt rail section, which will cause an overlap of the rail from the top section to the next section. Insert all the bolts of the clamp rail through their respective holes, making sure the clamp rail is seated all the way into the bottom of the screen hook. Also, make sure the head of the bolt is locked into the square hole of the clamp rail. Hand tighten the nuts on one side of the screen basket. Then go to the other side and put the clamp rails on and hand tighten those nuts. Do all of the bottom deck sections hand tight first before you tighten up all the bolts, as you may have to do some adjusting. Once you have hand tightened all the bolts, go back and tighten up one side, then go to the other side and torque tighten it. You may then want to go back to the other side and tighten it again, just to be sure both sides are good and tight. When tightening, you want to have equal pressure on the screen so that it fits snug across all the crown bars. Make sure that all the clamp rails are seated correctly into the screen hook. If the screen cloth is not tight on top of the crown bar rubber or seated wrong, the screen cloth will be loose and will fail down the middle in a short period of time. If this is the case, find the problem and retighten the screen cloth. Now that the bottom deck or decks are installed, you can install the top deck screen cloth. It's done the same as the bottom deck, except it's easier due to the ease of access to the top deck. Always start from the top of the screen and work down. Again, make sure all screen rails and the clamp rails are clean. Install in the same fashion as you did the bottom deck. Always put the clamp rails on the screen and tighten down prior to reinstalling the screen feed plate, because if you put the screen feed plate on first, you may not get the clamp rails on. Now you may want to bring the feed conveyor back up into the working position so that you can marry the rubber from the screen to the feed belt while installing the screen feed plate. If you had to take the bottom deck screens out the back of the screen, then go back and reinstall the top deck's overshoot. Make sure the old screens are out of the way. Fold back down all side discharge conveyors. Start the engine and go through your startup procedure by starting the screen, all conveyors, and the feed conveyor. Now check to make sure there's no banging sounds, loose bolts, or belts. Then start loading the hopper. Regulate the feed speed, and you're back to work. After a screen change, make sure you go back at least several times in the next couple of days and check to make sure that all screen bolts and nuts are good and tight, as they may have worked loose. Ball deck. If you have ordered as an option a ball deck, such as this one, it will be positioned underneath your bottom deck. The balls are all held in by a cage and supported on all sides. A slotted screen tray is brought up underneath and held up by U-bolts and tightened down. The balls bounce back and forth and help keep the screen clear. The screen tray is also a wear item and may wear out after time and need to be replaced. The balls will last a long time, but may also need to be replaced. Maintenance. This is the hydraulic motor that runs a belt-driven sheave that runs a pulley to the inside eccentric shaft that drives the screen. If a belt comes loose, needs to be replaced, or you need to add or change weights on the eccentric, then you need to loosen these 4 bolts. Once these are loose, you can go underneath and loosen the tensioning rod that either tightens or loosens the hydraulic motor base, as shown here. Now go back up by the motor and take off this outer housing that guards the belts and drive system for the screen. Take off all nuts and bolts of this guard and remove the guard. This will expose the sheave and all the belts. When starting up the screen, if you hear a squealing sound, the belts may be too loose. If you need to change weights, you'll have to take the belts off and remove the outer guard that guards the weights and the drive shaft. Take all the nuts and bolts off and remove the guard. Now you can add or delete weights accordingly. You must add or delete weights equally with the other side. The opposite side is much easier to get to the weights and drive shaft, as there is only one guard to remove. This is the bang board that should be adjusted so that the material coming off of the underscreen conveyor hits the bang board and falls in the middle of the side discharge conveyor. By doing so, you'll also be able to track the discharge belt properly. Use the adjustments of these brackets to accomplish this. This is your Donaldson air cleaner. This should be checked often, especially in dusty conditions, and either cleaned or replaced. To do this, simply release the lockdown underneath. Remove the filter, check for tears and damage, and then either clean out or replace the filter. Check your owner's manual for a changing schedule. Construction Equipment Company has built over 400 CEC Screenit plants. We've thought out and engineered the entire plant, but we're not out in the field with you day in and day out, and it's the general maintenance of the plant that's going to make it a performer and a producer for you and your company. So please make sure to go back and tension the couplers, tension the hydraulic components, and the cables that hold out the conveyors. Tighten nuts and bolts. Check your wear on the skirt board rubber and the belt wipers. It's important to go back and make sure the keyways and the bushings and the couplers are all tight. Check your blocking to make sure the plant is still level and secure. It's important to make sure you clean up underneath the plant for material buildup. Follow all maintenance schedules, and if you have any questions or need repairs, please feel free to call the CEC Service Department at 503-692-9000. We'll be happy to take care of your needs. All of your maintenance and attention to detail are going to make your CEC Screenit a highly productive and profitable performer. Following this will be a section on belt tracking, belt splicing, screens, and safety procedures. All of us at Construction Equipment Company are proud and pleased that you've chosen one of CEC's screening plants to be a performer for you and your company. Let's look at one of your crushing plant's biggest problems: belt adjustment, belt training, and skirt board adjustment. Let's take a conveyor and walk through the proper sequence of setup. First, we need to adjust the feed box skirt boards. These need to have a clearance of 1/16 inch between the belt and the skirt board. A hacksaw blade is a great gauge. If the skirt boards are too tight, we get welding, which causes bad belt tracking and over horsepower use on the drive motor. Next, tension the belt. Remove the lower side guard to gain clear access. There should be normally 3.5 inches to 4 inches of belt sag between the return idlers. The idler needs to be square to the conveyor frame. The head and tail pulleys also need to be square to the conveyor frame. The tensioning is done by the bottom belt adjustments on the standard conveyors. Replace the side guards when adjustment is complete. Belt tracking is accomplished by steering the troughing rollers. Advance the opposite edge forward to force the belt over and cause the belt to run true. Look up the belt and steer the roller like you are steering a bike. The belt will respond. The motor to gearbox drive belts will need adjustment. The standard formula for adjusting is to measure the belt centers. Example, 15 inches. Adjust the belt to have 1/64 of an inch of sag per inch of center distance. This works with all V-belts on conveyors and stackers. Note, CEC uses Dodge gearboxes on all conveyors and stackers. You need to check the oil level of these boxes before startup. Shipping on some conveyors requires the boxes to be without oil. Check yours before running. Consult your Parts and Service Book Dodge section for proper lubrication and oil level. Belt splicing. In order to help you learn new service techniques with a crusher and screen, we will show you how to splice a replacement conveyor belt. Measure the belt length or consult CEC for the proper lengths. Be sure you order the ends cut square to the side so you do not have to recut the ends, causing the belt to be too short. Open the belt ends up so you can work with them. Take one end, square the punching template to the belt, and nail it through to a 2x12 beam for support. .45° to horizontal stroke. Along with the incline, this stroke causes the product to travel down the screen so the material can be separated. The screen can run at different speeds as required. CEC's eccentric system can be run at one of three speeds: 820 RPM, low speed, heavy rock; 940 RPM, medium speed, medium rock; 980 RPM, high speed, maximum separation, light rock. CEC has the ability to vary not only the speed, but also the counterweight of the shaft. This gives CEC screens the ability to increase the length of the stroke and make the screen clear even in arrow-shaped materials and compost. Change the sheaves for speed and change the counterweights for length of stroke. CEC has two styles of lubrication for the screen bearing, either running in oil or grease. 5x16 and larger screens have running in oil bearings. You can order running in oil bearings on smaller screens for an optional charge before manufacture. CEC screens, up to and including the 5x14 screen, use an adjustable shaft-mounted external counterweight to cause the stroke. Larger 6x16 and 6x20 screens use both eccentric center shafts and external counterweights. The larger screens have more mass and load than the external weights can handle. CEC screens have strokes that vary from 3/8 of an inch to 5/8 or 3/4 of an inch. The screen shown in this video is the famous Screen It screen and will be running at 5/8 stroke to provide good material feed and product clearing. The second deck of the screen shown has square 1.5-inch cloth installed. The top deck of the screen will have steel plate, 1/4 inch thick with 3-inch round holes. Now let's talk a little about the installation of screen cloth. The clamp rails that hold the cloth in position must pull the cloth tight from the center out to each of the sides. It's possible to have the clamp rail bolts as tight as you can turn them and still not have the cloth tight. Here's a walkthrough of the proper installation procedure. Check all of your crown bar rubber to make sure it's in good working order. Check the crown bar to make sure you don't have any mechanical problems. Example, look for bad wear patterns. Make sure the clamp bar bolts are straight and that the holes are clean and clear. Drop the screen cloth on the deck and check it for proper forming dimension. Screen cloth has a manufacturer's recommended forming width outside of hooks, normally referred to as OSH. This screen has a recommended forming width of 58.5 inches OSH. The difference between the inside of the basket of 60 inches and the 58.5 inch OSH gives you clamping room and allows for cloth stretch. Now let's talk about clearance. Most screens are made for standard wire size. When you go to heavier wire gauges and/or banded wire, you could as much as double the thickness. This new thickness can stop your clamp rails from breaking over the closing arc, so you can tighten the cloth. The clamp rail bolts pull tight, but you've created a new problem. The clamp rail drives down on the screen cloth banding and extra thickness. This bottoms out on the solid steel underclamp bar wedge and causes the bolt to pull tight and the mass to be locked solid. Your first impression is that your job is done. Not so. Your cloth is still loose. You need to remount the clamp bolt wedges to allow additional bolt travel until the rail breaks over. Or you can install a shorter-legged clamp rail for heavy-duty cloth application. CEC can make this for you as a special order. If you're breaking screen cloth down the center of the panel, it tells you that the cloth was not tight. The screen cloth will, without exception, break if it is not properly tensioned and all faces pulled tight on the crown bars. Be certain you've done this properly. It doesn't matter who manufactured the screen basket or brand of screen cloth. If the cloth is not fit properly, it will break. You can have the bolts tight, the clamp rail bottomed out, but still be loose in the center. You think you're okay, but in a few hours your cloth will be ruined. The correct operation is with the rails over center and cloth properly tightened and snug on the crown bars. It's easy to change the cloth size, banding, and screen wire diameter, thereby causing yourself a problem that was not a problem before the change. Look at the ends of the clamp rails and make sure they're over center. Your screen cloth supplier will not replace cloth that is broken down the center. He knows what has happened as soon as you tell him where the cloth failed. Now let's take a look at CEC's drive mechanism. CEC motors mount off the subframe and have a bolt tensioner to adjust the belts. CEC uses multi-groove sheaves and #1 quality belts. Changing the motor sheaves can vary screen speed. Do not do this change without CEC direction. Overspeed, combined with improper counterweight combination, can cause premature bearing failure or mechanism damage. All CEC screens use cast steel, machined bearing housing, and special screen bearings to assure good life and easy service. The drives are enclosed and the counterweights are guarded. CEC screens are always supplied with subframes that facilitate the CEC rubber suspension system and motor drives. CEC does not use a pivoting motor base. Like several other major manufacturers, CEC uses an offset taper lock in the screen drive bushing to compensate for screen stroke movement. They're much less trouble than spring-loaded tables. The complete screen module is easy to install, comes with under hopper, under conveyor, walkway, railing, kick plates, guards, crown bar rubber, motor, drives, and drive guards. It comes with mounting channels ready to bolt in place. Special discharge lips are not a problem as long as we get good information from the customer. Remember, your screen is only as good as your maintenance. Lubricate the screen according to your manual. Keep the belts properly tightened and in good shape. Do as we recommend, and you will have long, trouble-free service. Safety first is CEC's goal. With this video, CEC wants to remind you of safety first. The following are points you must always consider. Always lock out the power source to the crusher you're working on. First, remove the engine key and put it in the pocket of the man who will be doing the work. Second, lock out the electric switchgear with a padlock and put the key in the pocket of the man doing the work. This procedure will help avoid the chance of a false startup of equipment that could, in turn, injure the worker who is performing the maintenance on the crusher. Never operate a CEC product without first reading the operation and maintenance manuals. Read all the caution and advice labels on your machine prior to operation. The labels are placed on the plant for your protection and for your fellow workers. Inform your fellow workers and all new workers of the safety requirements of the CEC equipment. Never make adjustments to any CEC machine while it's running. This avoids getting clothing caught in moving parts and possibly being pulled into the machine. Never try to remove anything from a crusher while it's running. It's very dangerous. You need to stop the crusher completely and lock out before trying to remove unwanted input items. Review your machine setup. Add safety guards to any area your setup would need to provide a safe work environment for your workers. Safety first is CEC's goal.
Most people never realize the damage that loud noises do to their hearing until much later. That's the dangerous thing about hearing loss. It comes on gradually, over time. Right now, the noise just seems like an annoyance. Sometimes it's not until years later that you suddenly start going, "Huh? Could you speak a little louder?" By then, it's too late. A general rule of thumb for hearing protection is this. If you can't carry on a conversation in a normal tone of voice when you're 3 feet apart, then you need some kind of hearing protection. Now, these guys are more than 3 feet apart, but they're screaming, and they don't have the faintest idea what the other is saying. Wouldn't it be better to just have this conversation at lunch? There's basically 2 types of hearing protection in this industry: earplugs and earmuffs. Earplugs are generally found like this, in a disposable package. They're economical and clean, and are generally more for random, occasional use than the earmuffs. You might want to carry a packet of these in your pocket to use when someone else nearby is operating some loud machinery. Remember the rule of thumb. If you're 3 feet away and you can't carry on a normal conversation, your eardrums are probably suffering. All you do is kind of scrunch these up and stick them in your ear. You'll notice that you can still hear things. It just takes the edge off the sound. Ear muffs you'll want to use especially when you're the one operating the equipment. They tend to be a bit more comfortable, and they knock out a little bit more vibration. You can get ear muffs that attach right to your hard hat, so you always have them with you, or you can use the type that are separate. But don't just put up with the loud noise, especially if you're working in a confined area, because like I said, you don't really know for sure how much damage is being done to your hearing until later. And when you're working in a confined area, the echoing makes the sounds become more intensified. Areas like these should be taped or roped off to keep workers without hearing protection away. That's one thing to remember, though. You have to be especially alert when you're wearing hearing protection, because you won't be able to hear warning signals quite so easily. And be sure to use only inspected and improved equipment. Hey, you guys! Wear your earplugs or your earmuffs. Doesn't matter to me. Those guys are on their way to a serious hearing loss. Is that something you would choose?
Thank you for watching this CEC video.